Evening, friend. Come sit by the fire. Pull that chair in close. There's room enough and the night's stern cold. Got a story tonight about a woman who was handed 30 days to do the work that used to take a whole crew of men, and about a brand that folks in one quiet valley would come in time to call the widow's brand. Pour yourself something warm. Settle back and let me tell you about the autumn Clara Renfield drove 200 head of cattle the long 90 miles to the railhead, alone. The way I heard it told, the bank gave Clara Renfield 30 days. 30 days to drive 200 head of cattle the 90 miles to the railhead, or sign the deed over to the men who'd been circling her land like buzzards since the morning they buried her husband. 200 head. Open country. Rivers that didn't care who you were, and not one hired hand left on the place to help her move them. Her Daniel had made that drive every autumn of his life. Clara had never made it once, and now there was no one left to make it but her. She stood at the corral gate in the gray light, looked out at all those cattle waiting, and did the only thing a body could do. She went and saddled her horse. Welcome to Western Sleep Story, where the Old West carries you to sleep. Every week, I sit by this fire and tell a new tale, slow, calm, with nothing but the crackle of the flame, and a story worth drifting off to. If you're new here, you're welcome to stay as long as you like. And if these stories help you rest, that little subscribe button means you'll never have to look for the fire again. It'll be right here, waiting.
Now, you have to understand the kind of quiet that had settled over the Renfield place by the time this story begins. It was the quiet of a house where a man used to be. Daniel Renfield had built that ranch with his own 2 hands, board by board, fence post by fence post, across the better part of 20 years. He had branded every calf that wore the Renfield mark. A simple thing, a letter R laid on its back, what the old hands called a lazy R, and he had ridden out at first light every single morning of his married life, and he had come home every single evening to a wife who kept a lamp burning in the window for him. Clara had kept that lamp burning for 19 years. And then one gray morning in the early autumn, Daniel rode out to mend a fence in the high pasture, and his horse came home without him, and that was all. A bad fall on rough ground. No warning, no goodbye. Just a horse standing at the gate with an empty saddle, waiting to be let in. They buried him on the rise behind the house, where you could see the whole valley spread out below, the way he'd always liked it. And then the valley got very quiet.
Clara had not cried much at the burying. Folks noticed that, and some of them whispered about it the way folks do. But Clara was not a woman who fell apart where people could see. She was tall and weathered, and her hands were strong from years of work most women never had to do, because the Renfields had never been able to afford much in the way of hired help, and so Clara had ridden alongside Daniel through every roundup and every branding and every long winter the land had thrown at them. That had always been Daniel's job. He made the autumn drive to the railhead at Cheyenne every fall, 90 miles north and east across open range, and he hired on 3 or 4 hands to help him do it, and he came back with a roll of bank money that carried them through the winter and paid down the note on the land. 3 weeks after they buried him, the letter came from the bank. It was a polite letter, the way those letters always are. It expressed its condolences. It noted with regret that the mortgage payment on the Renfield property would come due on the 15th of November, as it did every year, and that the bank trusted Mrs. Renfield would be making her arrangements. It was signed by a man named Mr. Pruitt, who Clara had met exactly twice and who had never once looked her in the eye when he did.
Clara read the letter standing at her own kitchen table. Then she set it down, and she did the arithmetic in her head, the same arithmetic Daniel had done every fall. The note could only be paid one way. It could only be paid with cattle, with 200 head of beef on the hoof, driven to the railhead and sold by the pound to the buyers who came down from the stockyards. There was no other money. There had never been any other money. The land paid for itself in beef, or it did not pay for itself at all. And there was something else Clara understood. Sitting there in that quiet kitchen with the letter on the table, she understood that there were men in the valley who already knew all of this. Men who had counted the days since the burying, the same as she had. Chief among them was a cattleman named Harlan Voss, who owned the big spread to the east and had wanted the Renfield water rights for 20 years, and who had come to the funeral in a black coat and stood at the back and watched the proceedings the way a man watches a horse he is thinking of buying. Voss had not waited long. Within the week he had sent his foreman over with an offer for the land. A low offer, a cruel one, the kind of offer a man makes when he believes the other party has no choice. Clara had turned it down at the door. The foreman had tipped his hat and said, real friendly, that the offer would still be good come the 15th, when she'd had time to think things over, when she'd come to understand her situation. That was the word he used, situation.
So Clara understood her situation just fine. She had 200 head of cattle standing in the home pasture and a note coming due, and a buyer waiting like a patient animal for her to fail. She had no hands. The two boys who'd helped Daniel through the summer had drifted off looking for winter work the moment the wages stopped. She had 30 days, and she had 90 miles of open country between her cattle and the only place those cattle could be turned into the money that would save her home. Most folks in that valley, if you'd asked them, would have told you it couldn't be done. A woman alone could not move 200 head 90 miles. Cattle scattered. Cattle drowned at crossings and bogged in draws and bolted in the night. It took men, several of them riding point and swing and drag and night herd, just to keep a herd of that size moving in one direction. One person with one good horse and a tired old cattle dog could no more drive that herd to Cheyenne than she could carry it there on her back. Clara folded the banker's letter into a small square and set it on the mantel beside the photograph of Daniel in his good Sunday coat. She looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she went out to the barn, and in the dim and the dust and the smell of leather and horse, she found Daniel's saddle on its rack where it had hung untouched for 3 weeks. She ran her hand along the worn seat of it, and she carried it out to the corral where her best horse stood waiting in the gray morning light, and she lifted it onto his back, and she cinched it down tight. The old blue heeler, a dog named Tip, who had been Daniel's shadow for 9 years and hers ever since, came out of the barn and stood watching her with his head tilted, the way dogs do when they sense that something is about to be asked of them. Clara looked down at him. "Well," she said. It was the first thing she had said out loud in 3 days. "It's just us then," said.
And Tip wagged his tail once, slow, like he agreed. "You don't move 200 head of cattle the way you'd think. You don't drive them exactly the way a man drives a wagon. You ease them. You let them find the direction, and then you keep them in it, riding the edges, turning back the ones who try to peel off, gathering up the stragglers, never hurrying, because a hurried herd is a frightened herd, and a frightened herd will run. And once cattle run, you've lost them." Daniel had taught Clara all of this over 19 years, taught it without ever meaning to teach, just by having her ride beside him. And now every word of it came back to her as she opened the corral gate that first cold morning and let the herd spill out onto the open range. It was slow going. Lord, it was slow. The cattle did not want to leave the home pasture, where the grass was familiar and the water was close. They milled and balked and turned in circles, and Clara rode back and forth along the flanks of the herd until her horse was lathered and her own back ached, easing them, pressing them, turning them north a few head at a time. Tip worked the heels, darting in and out, nipping at the slow ones, doing the work of 3 men with that uncanny patience the good cattle dogs have. By the time the sun was well up, Clara had the herd strung out and moving in a long, ragged line across the open country, and she rode at the back of them, in the position the old drovers called riding drag, eating their dust, because the back of the herd was where the trouble was, where the weak and the slow and the stubborn fell behind and had to be pushed along. The dust got into everything, her eyes, her throat, the creases of her hands. By mid-morning she had Daniel's bandana pulled up over her nose and mouth, and Daniel's hat pulled low, and from a distance you could not have told whether the rider at the back of that herd was a man or a woman, or just a shape made of dust and weariness. She made maybe 8 miles that first day, 8 miles out of 90. She did the arithmetic again, the way she would do it every night of the drive, lying awake. 8 miles a day for 30 days was 240 miles, which was plenty, except the cattle could not be pushed 8 miles every day, not without losing weight, and weight was money, and money was the whole point. 12 miles was a good day, 10 was honest, and there were rivers ahead and rough country, and the cattle would slow at every one of them. She would have to do better than 8. But the first day was always the worst, Daniel used to say. The herd had to learn to trail. After a few days they'd settle into it, fall into the rhythm of moving, and then the miles would come easier. She had to believe that. So she believed it. That first night she made a dry camp in the lee of a low ridge where the herd could bed down on good grass, and there was a little creek for water. She unsaddled her horse and picketed him close. She built a small fire from a bundle of wood she'd brought in the pack. There'd be no wood once they got out onto the real flats, and she'd have to learn to cook over a fire of dried buffalo chips, the way the old trail hands did, but she wasn't there yet. She boiled coffee and ate a little cold bacon and a biscuit gone hard, and she sat by the fire with Tip pressed warm against her leg, and she listened to the sounds of 200 cattle settling in for the night, the low groans and shuffles, the click of horns, the soft, endless lowing that a bedded herd makes, like the breathing of something very large and very calm. It was a sound she had heard 1,000 times, but always before, Daniel had been on the other side of the fire. There is a thing that happens to a person on the trail, friend, that folks who've never done it can't quite understand.
The work strips a body down to the plain bones of itself. There is no room out there for the things that crowd a person's mind in an ordinary life. The small worries, the old regrets, the 100 little griefs a heart carries around like stones in a pocket. There is only the next mile and the next, and the weather and the cattle and the light going down at the end of the day. The trail asks one thing of a person at a time, and it asks it plain, and there is a mercy in that. Clara had not understood when she set out that the very hardness of the thing might be the closest thing to comfort she would find. But by that first quiet night, with her body aching in a clean and honest way, and the herd bedded calm under the stars, she had begun to understand it. Grief is a kind of work, too, she thought, looking into the small flames. Maybe the only way through it was to put it to the trail along with everything else, and let the long miles wear it down to something a body could carry. She did not cry even then, but she sat for a long while looking into the flames, and she let herself remember just a little, because there is a kind of remembering that helps a person and a kind that hurts them, and Clara had learned the difference. She remembered Daniel teaching her to sing low to a restless herd, the way the cowboys did, because cattle settled to a steady human voice in the dark. She remembered him saying that a good night herder never raised his voice, never made a sudden move, just rode slow circles around the bedded cattle and sang whatever came to mind, hymns and trail songs and foolish little ditties, the words hardly mattering, only the steadiness of the sound. She remembered the Psalms.
So that first night, when the wind shifted and a few of the cattle came up off their beds restless, Clara mounted her tired horse and rode out into the dark and made a slow circle around the herd. And she sang. She sang low and steady, an old hymn her mother had taught her. And the cattle heard her voice in the dark, and they knew it was the same voice that had eased them all that long day. And one by one they folded their legs back under them and lay down again. and Clara rode her circles in the starlight, singing soft to 200 head of cattle, until the small hours when at last the herd lay still and quiet, and she could ride back to the dying fire and sleep a few hours with the dog against her side. The way I heard it, that was how the first day ended. 8 miles. 1 woman, 1 horse, 1 dog, 200 head, and a song in the dark. And the worst of the 30 days still ahead of her. But dawn came clear and cold, the way autumn dawns do on the high range, and Clara woke before the light, and she made her coffee, and she saddled up, and she eased the herd up off their beds and turned them north again, because that was the only direction there was.
By the 3rd day, the herd had learned to trail. Daniel had been right about that, the way he'd been right about most things. The cattle had stopped fighting the direction. They'd found a kind of order among themselves. The old led steers up at the front, the cows and calves in the body of it, the slow and the lame at the back where Clara rode. They moved out willing in the mornings now, and they strung out long and easy across the country, and Clara found she could ride the swing position part of the day up along the side of the herd and let them flow north under their own momentum, while Tip held the drag. The arithmetic for the first time was starting to come out in her favor, but the 3rd day was also the day the country began to turn against her. The easy home range gave way, as she'd known it would, to a stretch of broken ground, dry washes and shallow coulees cut into the prairie, where the cattle balked and scattered and had to be gathered up one draw at a time. It was slow, frustrating work, the kind that wore at a person, and by the afternoon Clara was bone-tired and short of patience, and her horse was flagging under her. She had pushed up onto a low rise to look ahead at the country, to find the easiest line through the breaks, when she happened to glance back along her own trail, and she saw the dust. 2 riders, coming up behind her along the line the herd had cut, maybe 2 miles back, riding easy but riding steady, the way men ride who mean to catch up to something. Clara sat very still on the rise and watched them come. 2 men, alone, in open country, behind a woman driving a herd by herself. She did not have to be told what that could mean. The range was not always a kind place to a woman alone, and Clara had no illusions about it. She reached down without hurry and loosened the rifle in the scabbard under her knee. Daniel's rifle, which she had carried every mile of the drive and prayed she would not have to use. And she turned her horse so the rise was between her and the riders, and she waited. They came on. As they got closer, she could make them out better. An older man on a tall bay, gray showing under his hat, sitting his horse the easy, bow-legged way of a man who'd spent his whole life in a saddle. And a younger one beside him, hardly more than a boy, riding a paint pony, looking around at the country with the open, curious face of someone who had not yet learned to hide what he was thinking. They did not look like the kind of men who circled a woman alone. But Clara had learned long ago that men did not always look like what they were. So she kept the rise between them and kept her hand near the rifle, and she let them come to her. When they were 100 yards off, the older man saw her sitting there waiting. He drew rein, and then he did a thing that eased Clara more than any words could have. He took off his hat. He held it against his chest, and he sat there bareheaded in the cold afternoon wind. And he called out across the distance in a voice gone rough with years and weather, "Ma'am, we don't mean you any trouble. We come a long way looking for the Renfield outfit. Would you be Mrs. Renfield?" Clara did not answer right away. She studied the 2 of them, the gray-headed man with his hat against his chest, the boy beside him looking suddenly anxious, the way the young do when they sense they've ridden into something they don't understand. Then she nudged her horse out from behind the rise so they could see her plain, a woman in a dead man's hat with a rifle under her knee, and she said, "I'm Clara Renfield. My husband's 3 weeks in the ground, if that's who you came looking for." She watched the words land on the older man. She watched his face change, watched something go out of it. some hope he'd been carrying, and watched something heavier settle in to take its place. He looked down at his hands on the saddle horn for a moment. When he looked up again, his eyes were wet, though whether from the wind or from grief, Clara could not have said. "Daniel's gone," the old man said. It was not a question. He said it the way a man says a thing he has just had to make himself believe. "He is," Clara said. "Did you know him?" The old man was quiet a moment. The wind moved the dry grass between them. Behind Clara, the herd lowed and shifted. 200 heads spread across the broken ground, restless to be moving again before the light failed. "Ma'am," the old man said at last, "my name is Eli Cobb. This here's my sister's boy, Wade. And I knew your husband a long time ago in a hard winter, when knowing a man was the difference between living and dying." He turned the brim of his hat in his hands. "I owe Daniel Renfield a debt I never got the chance to pay. We heard down at the railhead that the Renfield widow was driving her herd to Cheyenne alone, against the bank. And I told this boy we were going to ride till we found her." He looked at the long line of cattle, at the broken country ahead, at the one tired woman who had been holding all of it together by herself for 3 days. "Looks like we found her in time," he said. "If you'll have us, ma'am, we've come to make your drive."
Now, Clara Renfield was not a woman who trusted easy. She had been raised by a hard father in a hard country and married into a harder life, and 3 weeks of widowhood had taught her exactly how the world looked at a woman with land and no man to hold it. So she did not just say yes to 2 strangers who rode up out of the dust with a sad story and their hats in their hands. A sad story was the easiest thing in the world to come by, even a true one. So she sat her horse and she looked at Eli Cobb for a long moment, and she said, "What debt?" The old man did not flinch from the question. He seemed, if anything, glad of it. "Winter of the bad snow," he said. "You'd have been young then, ma'am, maybe not even married yet. I was driving a small herd of my own through this country, trying to get to market before the weather closed in, and the weather beat me. Caught me out on the flats north of here in a blizzard that lasted 4 days. I lost the herd, lost my partner. He wandered off in the white, and we never found him till the thaw. And I'd have lost myself too, frozen stiff in a snowbank, except a young rancher named Daniel Renfield found me half dead in the lee of a dead steer, threw me over his saddle, and carried me 12 miles through that storm to his own fire. Sat up 3 nights bringing me back, fed me, though he didn't have much. Gave me a horse when I had none and never asked a dime for it." Eli Cobb's voice was steady, but his hands were not. "I told him I'd pay him back some day. He laughed and said a man didn't keep books on a thing like that. But I kept the books, ma'am. I have kept them 30 years, and I aim to settle the account." He let that sit. The wind blew. The boy Wade watched his uncle with the particular pride of the young, the look of someone hearing a story he has heard before but never gets tired of. Clara looked at the old man's hands shaking on the reins, and she looked at the long miles of broken country ahead of her. And she did the arithmetic one more time, not the arithmetic of miles and dollars this time, but the older, harder arithmetic of trust, the weighing of what a person stood to lose against what they stood to gain. And here is the thing she understood sitting there. A man who meant her harm did not need a story. 2 men against 1 woman alone in empty country needed no excuse and no permission. The very fact that Eli Cobb had ridden up bareheaded, had asked her leave, had told her a thing that cost him something to tell. That was not the behavior of a man with bad intent. That was the behavior of a man paying a debt. But Clara had not survived 3 weeks a widow by trusting her own first read of people, so she gave them the only answer a careful woman could. "One day," she said, "you'll ride with me one day, the both of you. You'll earn your keep and you'll bed down on the far side of the fire, and at the end of that day I'll tell you whether you ride the second." She looked the old man in the eye. "That's the offer, Mr. Cobb. Take it or leave it." Eli Cobb put his hat back on his head. For the first time something like a smile moved in the gray stubble of his face. "That's fair," he said. "That's more than fair. Wade, you heard the lady. Take the drag and give that dog a rest."
and the boy grinned and touched his hat and loped his paint pony down toward the back of the herd, and the old man swung his bay out wide to take the point, and Clara watched the two of them fall into the work like men who had done it 1,000 times, easy and unhurried and right, and she felt something in her chest she had not felt in 3 weeks. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the first loosening of a knot that had been pulled tight since the morning a horse came home without its rider.
They made 14 miles that day, 14 the best day of the drive, because for the first time there were 3 of them and a dog to hold 200 head of cattle, and the work that had been crushing one woman was suddenly only hard. That night the old man cooked. He was a better hand at a fire than Clara was, and he made the biscuits come out soft, which Clara's never did. And Wade told stories that made even Clara smile. And Eli Cobb bedded down on the far side of the fire without being told, the way she'd asked, and never said a word about it. And when the wind came up in the small hours and a few head rose restless from their beds, it was 3 riders who went out into the dark to settle them. And Clara heard old Eli Cobb's rough, cracked voice take up a trail song on the far side of the herd, low and steady, and heard young Wade's clear young voice come in under it. And she sang too, the 3 of them circling that bedded herd in the starlight, 3 strangers singing 200 head of cattle back down to sleep. And somewhere in the singing, Clara made up her mind that they would ride the 2nd day, and the 3rd, and all the way to Cheyenne. Now, if you're still awake and this fire is keeping you company tonight, I'm glad you're here. If you'd like more nights like this, a subscribe and a quiet little tap on that bell means I can keep these stories coming, one fire at a time. But for now, let's get back to where we were, out on the trail with Clara and old Eli and the boy, and 200 head of cattle, and a long way still to go.
The drive settled after that into something Clara would remember the rest of her life, though it would be a long time before she could let herself remember it kindly. They fell into a rhythm, the 4 of them, counting the dog. Old Eli Cobb rode the point in the mornings, picking the line through the country with an eye that had read 40 years of trail, finding the gentle grades and the easy water and steering the herd wide of the bogs and the badlands. Clara rode the swing, holding the body of the herd together, and she found that, with the worst of the work taken off her, she could lift her head now and then and actually see the country she was crossing, the great tawny sweep of the autumn grass, the cottonwoods burning gold along the creek bottoms, the antelope that lifted their heads to watch the herd pass, and then drifted off white-rumped over the rises. And young Wade rode the drag and ate the dust, and never once complained about it, because, as he confided to Clara one evening, his uncle had told him that a man earned the right to ride point by first being willing to ride drag, and Wade meant to earn it. He was a good boy, Wade, 16, maybe 17, with a cowlick that wouldn't lie down and a way of asking questions that would have annoyed Clara from anyone older. His mother, Eli's sister, had died when he was small, and his father had never been worth the name, and so the boy had been raised hand to mouth in the camps and on the trails wherever his uncle could find work. He had never owned a thing in his life but the paint pony and the clothes on his back and a folding knife Eli had given him. And yet he was not a bitter child. He was, if anything, the most openly grateful person Clara had ever met. Grateful for the coffee in the morning, and the stars at night, and the simple fact of being needed. And there were evenings when his easy gladness was the only thing that got Clara through the dark. She remembered one day in particular, somewhere in the middle miles, that she would hold on to long after. It had been a soft blue day, windless and warm for the season, the kind of day the high country gives you now and then, like an apology for all the hard ones. The herd had trailed easy all morning with hardly any minding, and the 3 of them had ridden loose and quiet, And around the noon halt, Wade had taken it into his head to teach Tip a trick, to shake hands, of all the foolish things. And the boy had sat in the grass for the better part of an hour, patient as a saint, lifting that old dog's paw and praising him and lifting it again, until at last Tip caught the idea and offered his paw and his own, and Wade let out a whoop you could have heard a mile off. And old Eli had laughed, a real laugh, the first Clara had heard out of him, and Clara had found herself laughing too, sitting in the autumn grass with a half-eaten biscuit in her hand, laughing at a boy and a dog under a blue sky, and for a few minutes there she had forgotten entirely to be sad. She thought afterward that Daniel would have liked that day, that he would have liked these two, that he had, in a way she couldn't quite put words to, sent them to her across 30 years and 1,000 miles, the way a man sends provision ahead to a place he knows his family will someday have to pass. It was Wade, one night by the fire, who asked his uncle to tell the whole of it, the story of the blizzard, the story of Daniel, and Eli Cobb, who did not talk much, told it, slow and complete, because the boy asked and because the woman beside the fire had earned the hearing of it. He told how he'd been a young fool with more cattle than sense, trying to beat the winter to market, how the storm had come down out of the north like the end of the world, a wall of white that swallowed the sun and the sky and finally the ground itself, how he and his partner had tried to hold the herd and then tried to save themselves and managed neither, how his partner, a man named Tom Hale, Eli said, and he said the name carefully, the way you handle something fragile, had wandered off into the white to find a fence line and never come back. How Eli himself had given up finally, had lain down in the lee of a frozen steer and decided to let the cold take him because he was too tired and too lost to do anything else. And how, out of all that white nothing, a rider had appeared, a young rancher who had no business being out in that storm at all, who'd ridden out only because he'd seen cattle drifting wrong on his range and gone to turn them, and who'd found a half-dead man instead and chosen, without a moment's hesitation, to save him.
He didn't know me, Eli said into the fire. I was nothing to him, a stranger, freezing on his range. He could have ridden on, and no one would ever have known. The old man turned a coffee cup in his rough hands. But that wasn't the kind of man your husband was, ma'am. I expect you knew that better than anybody. He carried me home, and he sat up with me, and when I was strong enough to ride, he gave me a horse and pointed me south and told me to go make something of the life he'd handed back to me. Eli's jaw worked. I tried to. I want you to know that, both of you. I never got rich, and I never got famous, but I never lost another man in a storm, and I never once rode past somebody who needed help. That's the only way I knew to pay a thing like that back, by passing it down the line. He looked at Wade, then a long look, and the boy looked back, and Clara understood that she was watching the debt get paid in a way that had nothing to do with cattle or miles. That old Eli Cobb had been paying Daniel back for 30 years, one kindness at a time, to strangers Daniel had never met. They were quiet a while after that. The fire popped and settled. Somewhere out in the dark, the herd lowed soft and easy. It was Clara who broke the silence. "There's weather coming," she said. She'd been feeling it all afternoon, a heaviness in the air, a wrongness in the way the cattle had been moving. Daniel always said you could feel it in your teeth before you ever saw it. Eli nodded slow, looking off to the northwest where the first stars were being swallowed one by one. "I've been feeling it too," he said. "Tomorrow, maybe the day after, we'll want to be across the cold water before it breaks. I've heard it's no place to be on the wrong side of a river when the rain comes down." He set his cup aside and rose, his old knees cracking. "Best we all sleep while we can," he said. "I got a feeling the next few nights won't give us much chance. And the way I heard it, friend, the old man was right."
The storm came on the 7th night of the drive, and it came at the worst possible hour, which is the way of storms. They had pushed hard all that day to reach the cold water, and they had made it, bedding the herd down on the near bank just at dusk, meaning to cross at first light when the cattle were rested and the river could be read in good daylight. The cold water was running low for the season, an easy crossing in fair weather, and Eli had picked a good ford, a wide, shallow place where the bank shelved gentle and the bottom was firm gravel. They had every reason to think they'd be across by mid-morning, but the weather they'd all been feeling broke loose in the black middle of the night with no moon and no mercy, and it changed everything. It started with wind, then a stillness worse than wind, and then, far off to the northwest, a low growl of thunder and a flicker of light along the horizon that made the bedded cattle lift their heads as one. Clara was already up. She had not been sleeping, only lying in her blankets listening to the air, and she was pulling on Daniel's coat when the first real bolt came down, close and white and terrible, and split the night, and the thunder that followed it was not a growl but a blow, a thing you felt in your chest, and 200 head of cattle came up off their beds at once with a sound like the earth tearing.
This is the moment every drover fears above all others. A bedded herd, panicked in the dark, on the edge of a run. If they broke, they would run blind, and they would run for miles, and they would scatter across the night country and pile up in the draws and pour over the cut banks into the river. And by morning, half of them would be dead or gone, and the drive would be finished, the note unpaid, the land lost, all of it. Clara knew this in the half-second the lightning lit the world, and she knew there was only one thing to do, the thing Daniel had taught her on the 100 quiet nights for exactly this terrible one. She got to her horse. He was picketed close by habit, by Daniel's old, hard-learned rule, and she swung up bareback with the lead rope for a rein, and she rode straight into the heaving dark of the herd, and she began to sing. She did not think about the words. There was no thinking in a thing like that. She sang the old hymn her mother taught her, loud enough to carry over the wind and steady enough to mean something, riding slow circles at the edge of the milling cattle, turning the leaders, pressing them back on themselves so the herd wound into a great slow wheel instead of breaking into a run. And out of the dark on the far side she heard old Eli Cobb's cracked voice rise up singing the same kind of slow, steady song, and she heard the boy Wade somewhere between them, and the dog Tip working low and silent at the heels, and the three of them rode that storm out together, circling and singing and touring, holding 200 terrified animals together by nothing but the steadiness of 3 human voices in the dark.
It lasted hours. The rain came down in sheets and soaked them to the skin and ran cold off the brims of their hats. The lightning walked across the country all around them. Twice the herd nearly broke, and twice the 3 of them turned it, and once Clara's horse went down to his knees in the mud and came up again and never stopped. And through all of it Clara sang until her voice was gone to a rasp, and then she sang on without any voice at all, mouthing the words, because the cattle did not need the words. They needed only to know that the steady human thing was still there in the dark with them, still circling, still unafraid, or near enough to unafraid that it didn't matter. And just before dawn the storm rolled on south and east the way storms do, and the rain gentled to a drizzle, and then to nothing, and a gray light came up over a drowned and dripping world. And the herd, the whole herd, 200 head, not one of them lost, stood bunched and trembling and alive on the near bank of the Coldwater, blowing and steaming in the cold dawn. Clara sat her muddy horse in the gray light and counted them twice to be sure, and the count came right both times, and only then did she let herself feel how tired she was, tired all the way to the bone, tired in a way that sleep would not fix. But the river had risen in the night. That gentle, shallow ford was gone. The Coldwater had come up brown and fast and swollen with the storm's rain, and where there had been a wide, easy crossing, there was now a churning current carrying broken branches and whole uprooted trees, too deep to wade and too fast to be safe. And the deadline did not care about the rain. There was still 60 miles to Cheyenne and 11 days to the 15th, and the only way north lay across that river. They could wait for it to drop, but a flooded river might take 2 days to drop or it might take 5, and they did not have 5. Eli Cobb rode the bank in both directions, studying the water with his 40 years of trail savvy, and he came back grim. "She'll go down some by noon," he said, "not all the way, but enough maybe if we read her right and don't lose our nerve halfway. It'll be a hard crossing, ma'am, the hardest thing we do." He looked at Clara, rain still dripping from his hat. "But I've crossed worse with worse help, and your husband once carried me 12 miles through a thing that should have killed us both. I expect we can get your cattle across a river." And Clara, who had just sung a herd through a thunderstorm with a voice she no longer had, found that she believed him. They crossed the cold water a little after noon, when the river had dropped enough to risk it, and it was every bit as hard as Eli Cobb had promised. The trick of crossing a herd through deep water, the old man explained, was the lead. Get the lead steers swimming straight for the far bank, and the rest would follow them. Cattle are followers above all things. But if the leaders turned back, or began to mill in the current, the whole herd could wind into a deadly circle midstream and drown by the dozens. So Eli took the point, riding his big bay down into the brown water ahead of the lead steers, calling them on, and Wade and Clara pushed from behind, and the flanks, easing the herd into the river a few at a time, so it would not bunch and panic. The current took them and swung them downstream, and the far bank seemed impossibly distant, and for a few long minutes it hung in the balance, the lead steers swimming hard with old Eli ahead of them, the body of the herd strung out in the brown water, Clara on the upstream side turning back the ones who tried to swing wide. Her horse swam under her with only its nose and her own shoulders above the cold water, and she lost a stirrup and got it back, and never stopped calling the cattle on. And then the lead steers found the bottom on the far side, and heaved up dripping onto the gravel, and the herd followed them out of the water in a long, brown, streaming line, and it was done. They lost 3 head in the crossing, 3 out of 200 swept down and drowned in the flood, and Clara grieved them in the small way a drover grieves, because every animal was money and every animal was a life. But Eli told her gently that 3 out of 200 through a flooded river was a thing to be proud of, that good outfits with full crews had lost 10 times that and worse. And Clara believed him and let the 3 go and turned the rest north. After the cold water, the country gentled.
The last 60 miles unrolled easy under good autumn weather. The herd trail broke and obedient now, the 3 of them moving like an outfit that had ridden together for years. They made their miles. The arithmetic, which had hung over Clara like a sentence for 3 weeks, began at last to come out kind. And on the afternoon of the 12th day, 3 days ahead of the deadline, they topped the long rise and saw, spread out below them in the river valley, the smoke and the rooftops and the great fenced stockyards of Cheyenne, and the railroad running off east toward the markets and the money. The end of the trail. They did not push on into town that evening. There was no need. They were 3 days early, and a herd run hard into a strange place at dusk is a herd asking for trouble. So they made their last camp on the rise above Cheyenne, with the town's lamps coming on one by one in the valley below them like a scattering of low yellow stars. And they let the cattle graze easy on good grass one final night. It was a strange evening, that last one. None of them said much.
There is a particular quiet that comes over an outfit at the end of a long drive, a quiet made of weariness and relief and something almost like sorrow, because a thing that has been hard and whole and shared is about to be over, and everyone around the fire knows it, and no one wants to be the one to say so. Clara made the coffee that night, and she made the biscuits too, and they came out soft for once. Old Eli had finally taught her the trick of it somewhere back along the trail, and she'd gotten the knack, and the old man ate them and nodded his approval and didn't make a fuss, which from Eli Cobb was the highest praise there was. They sat late by the fire, the 3 of them and the dog, and they did not talk about the morning or the selling or the parting that was coming. They talked instead about small foolish things,
the way people do when the big things are too near to touch. And when at last they turned in, Clara lay in her blankets a long while looking up at the stars over Cheyenne, and she thought that she would remember this. Not the bank, not the money, not even the storm or the river, but this. A small fire on a rise above a town, and two good people on the far side of it, and a tired dog, and the end of a hard thing done right.
They sold the herd the next morning. The buyer from the stockyards walked the pens and ran his eye over 200 head of fat, trail-tough Renfield cattle, a few short of 200 now after the river, but a fine herd, a herd that did Daniel proud. And he made an offer, and old Eli Cobb stood at Clara's shoulder while she haggled and never said a word. Only let her do it because it was her herd and her drive and her right. She got a fair price, a good price, more than enough to pay the note and carry her through the winter and into the spring with something left over. The buyer counted the money into her hand in gold and bank paper, and Clara stood there in the dust and noise of the Cheyenne stockyards, holding more money than she had ever held in her life, the money that meant she got to keep her home, and for one moment the 3 weeks and the 30 days and all of it came up in her at once, and she had to turn away and put her hand over her mouth. And then it was time for Eli Cobb and the boy to go. Clara tried to pay them. Of course she did. She counted out wages, generous wages, drover's wages, and then some, and held the money out to the old man there on the street in Cheyenne. And Eli Cobb looked at the money in her hand, and he shook his gray head slow, and he closed her fingers back over it with both his rough old hands. "No, ma'am," he said. "You don't understand it yet, but you will. I didn't ride out here for wages." His eyes were wet again, the way they'd been that first afternoon on the broken ground. 30 years I carried a debt to a man who saved my life and asked nothing for it. I never thought I'd get the chance to pay it. And then I heard his widow was driving his cattle to market alone against the bank and against the odds, and I knew, ma'am, that the Lord had handed me the chance at last, to stand a drive for Daniel Renfield's family, to see his land kept and his wife safe and his cattle sold. The old man's voice broke, and he let it. "You paid me, Mrs. Renfield. You paid me the day you let me ride. The account's square now. Daniel and me, we're square." He stepped back and put his hat on his head, and beside him the boy Wade did the same, his young face solemn for once. "Keep your land," Eli said. "Keep it good, and someday, when you can, pass it down the line. That's all he ever asked of me. That's all I'll ask of you." And then the two of them mounted up, the old man on his tall bay and the boy on his paint, and they touched their hats to her, and they rode out of Cheyenne the way they'd come, two riders going small into the autumn distance, and Clara Renfield stood in the street with a fortune in her hand and watched them go until she couldn't see them any more. Clara rode home alone, but she did not ride home the same. She paid the note first thing, rode into the bank and laid the money on Mr. Pruitt's desk, and watched his face do something complicated when he understood that the widow Renfield had done the impossible, had driven her herd to Cheyenne and back, the note, and kept her land. He stamped the payment and gave her a receipt, and managed to say that he was very pleased. And Clara took her receipt and folded it small and did not trouble to answer him. On her way out of town she passed Harlan Voss's foreman on the street, the same man who'd come to her door with the cruel low offer and tipped his hat and talked about her situation. He saw her, and he understood, and he looked away first. Clara rode on by without a word. The land was hers. There was nothing left to say. She came home in the last gold light of an autumn evening, up the long familiar road to the ranch that was quiet still, but a different quiet now, not the hollow quiet of loss, but the deep settled quiet of a place that has been fought for and held. Tip jumped down off the wagon and ran ahead to check the barn and the corrals the way he always had. And Clara unsaddled her tired horse and turned him out, and stood for a while at the corral gate in the dusk, looking out over her land. Her land.
the grass going silver in the last light, the cottonwoods bare now along the creek, the rise behind the house where Daniel lay looking out over all of it, the way he'd always liked to. In the spring the calves came. They came the way they came every year in the soft April nights, and Clara was there for every one of them, because that was the work and the work was hers now. And when branding time came, she built the fire and heated the iron, the old Renfield iron, the simple, lazy R that Daniel had laid on every calf for 20 years. And she branded the new calves herself, one by one. The Renfield brand, her brand now, the widow's brand. Folks in the valley had taken to calling it, and they did not say it unkindly anymore. They said it the way you say the name of something that has proven itself. The widow Renfield's outfit, the widow's brand, the mark of a woman who'd driven 200 head to Cheyenne alone. Well, not quite alone. She'd correct them, if they said it that way. She'd tell them about an old man named Eli Cobb, and a boy named Wade, and a debt 30 years in the paying. But the rest of it was true. The land was hers, and the brand was hers, and she had earned them both. She never saw Eli Cobb again. But 2 years on, a letter came, a short letter in a careful, unpracticed hand, postmarked from a town 300 miles south, and it was from the boy Wade, grown now, who had learned his letters and wanted Clara to know that his uncle had passed in his sleep that winter, easy and at peace, and that the old man had spoken of her near the end. He'd said to tell the widow Renfield that the fire she'd let him sit beside on the trail had warmed him the rest of his days. And he'd said one more thing. Wade wrote that he didn't rightly understand, but had promised to pass along. He'd said, "Tell her the account is square, and tell her to pass it down the line." Clara read the letter twice, sitting at her kitchen table in the lamplight, with Daniel's photograph on the mantel and the spring rain soft on the roof. And then she folded it and put it away with the other things she kept, the things that mattered. And she sat a long while in the quiet, in the warm lamplight, in the home she had held, and she was not lonely, the way I heard it. She was something better than not lonely. She was at peace. She had been given a hard thing to do, and she had done it, and good people had come out of the dust to help her do it, the way good people sometimes do, and the land was safe, and the work went on, and the fire was warm. And outside in the spring dark, the new calves slept beside their mothers in the pasture, every one of them wearing the widow's brand. And that, friend, is the way I heard it told. And that is the way I heard it told. The fire is getting low now, low and warm, the way Clara's lamp burned in the window all those long nights. She kept her land, and she kept her husband's brand, and somewhere down the line, the way old Eli asked, that kindness is still being passed along, hand to hand, fire to fire, long after the people who started it have gone to their rest. There's a comfort in that, I've always thought, that the good things don't end, they just get handed down. You rest easy tonight, friend, and if this story gave you a quiet place to land, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who could use a peaceful night. Leave me a word in the comments. Tell me where the fire took you tonight. I read every one. I will be right here next time you need a story. The fire will be burning, same as always. Good night.